Chapter 1. The Ember-Stained Hearth. A gentle June breeze drifted through the open windows of Elmstead Vicarage, carrying with it the scent of freshly cut roses and honeysuckle. Inside, the great drawing room was arranged for afternoon tea. A gleaming silver samovar, delicate china cups patterned with ivy leaves, and platters of cucumber sandwiches and raspberry tarts. Sunlight dappled across the polished oak floor, lending the room a warm, honeyed glow that bounced off the scarlet hearth, still marked by last night's dying embers dot. At the heart of this serene tableau stood Miss Jane Marple, her snowy hair gathered in its customary bun, her keen gray eyes absorbing every detail. She wore a simple lilac frock and sat serenely on a cushioned armchair, a knitted shawl draped across her lap. To the casual observer, she might have seemed merely a kindly old lady visiting her friend, the Reverend Ambrose Lavington. Yet beneath that gentle exterior lay the acute mind that had solved mysteries the police had long since abandoned. Reverend Lavington, a portly man with a benevolent smile, hovered near the tea trolley. "We're so grateful, Miss Marple, that ye could join us today," he said, pouring fragrant Darjeeling into delicate cups. "This will be a small gathering, just a few of the village ladies and Mr. Harrington, the new gamekeeper. I trust the weather is agreeable." Outside, the manicured rose garden shimmered with sunlight. Not a cloud marred the pale blue sky. A soft murmur of voices drifted in the indistinct laughter of neighbors, strolling along gravel paths and the distant chirrup of sparrows. It was by every measure a perfectly ordinary summer afternoon that Mrs. Agnes Fawcett, the vicarage housekeeper, bustled forward with a silver tray of sweets. She was a stout woman whose starched apron and prim hairstyle spoke of decades of faithful service. "Cakes, your reverence?" she offered. "Thank you, Mrs. Fawcett," the Reverend replied, dipping a vanilla cream puff with his teaspoon. He glanced toward Miss Marple. "Shall we join the others in the garden? The view near the pond is quite charming this afternoon." Miss Marple rose, a faint rustle of her skirt, and allowed the Reverend to guide her toward the French doors. The party drifted out onto the sunlit terrace. Mrs. Beatrice Cole, widowed last winter, and still wearing black crepe leaned on her parasol, confiding quietly to Lady Edith Stretton, whose jewels glinted in the sun. Across the lawn, Mr. Oliver Harrington adjusted his cap. Tall and serious-eyed, he looked out of place among the domestic chatter, his hands roughened by woodland duty's dot as Miss Marple settled herself on a wicker chaise near the hearth-shaped flower-bed. A clever nod to the vicarage's grand fireplace, she scanned her companions with a practiced eye. Mrs. Cole's gloved fingertips trembled lightly around her teacup. Earlier, Miss Marple had noticed a dark bruise beginning to bloom at the widow's temple. Lady Stretton, by contrast, appeared radiantly composed, but had lingered too long beside the samovar, as though to hide something in her reticule. And Mr. Harrington, though polite, had kept his gaze fixed on the distant woodlands beyond the garden gate, as if expecting or dreading some forbidden visitor. The conversation meandered from village gossip to the upcoming fete in neighboring Marston on the hill. A sudden burst of laughter from the kitchen window drew attention back inside. Mrs. Fawcett was ushering in a fresh tray laden with rosewater biscuits, but paused abruptly, her expression shifting from dutiful calm to dismay. "My word," she murmured, clutching the tray so that a biscuit teetered perilously. "Something's not right." Reverend Lavington frowned. "What is it, Agnes?" "Lawks, sir," she said, voice quavering. "It's Miss Violet Grantham. She won't answer me." Mrs. Fawcett's eyes darted toward the hearth, where the embers still lay blackened. The library doors locked, and she's supposed to be in there. The assembled party exchanged curious glances. Violet Grantham, young, vivacious, the vicar's niece, had arrived only that morning for a brief stay. Known for her cheerful chatter and appetite for gossip, she was an unlikely candidate for a locked-room solitude. MissMarple rose, placing a gentle hand on Mrs. Fawcett's arm. "Calm yourself, my dear. Perhaps Miss Grantham has simply fallen asleep over her book." But as she reached for the brass knob, her intuition whispered otherwise. The door trembled slightly under her knock, but no reply came. The silence beyond the thick panels was too complete. No rustle of paper, no breath, nothing but a hollow echo. "Let me try," MissMarple said, moving aside, though Reverend Lavington placed a hand on her shoulder. "If there is a problem, it is best we see at once." With a small effort, she turned the key. This door unlocked easily for those who knew the vicarage's secrets, and pushed it open. The library lay dim in the afternoon light, bookshelves lining every wall. The scent of old leather mingled with the faint trace of pipe tobacco. But it was the hearth that drew her eye. The blackened stones bore fresh smudges of ash, as though someone had scraped embers across them moments ago. And at the base of the hearth, slumped in an armchair, sat the vibrant figure of Miss Violet Grantham. Her cream gown darkened by a spreading stain. Crimson bloomed across the fabric at her waist, and her hand lay limply upon the armrest, clutching a single matchstick, its head scorched. A small pool of blood had begun to seep beneath the chair's turned legs. MissMarple stood perfectly still, her face composed, yet beneath her calm lay a swirl of questions. A solitary matchstick? A locked room? An ember-stained hearth? The tableau was at once theatrical and horrifying. Reverend Lavington rushed forward. "Violet, good heavens, somebody fetch Dr. Kempthorne," Lady Stretton gasped. Mrs. Cole's gloved hands flew to her mouth. Mr. Harrington knelt beside the chair, his woodland-hardened hands trembling slightly. Yet through the shock and confusion, MissMarple's mind moved with steady precision. She noted the tilt of Violet's head, the faint ash on her fingers, the fact that the matchstick was burnt only at one end. She noticed, too, that the window behind the chair was latched from the inside, and the hearing aid-sized contraption on the mantelpiece presumably connected to the vicarage. Alarm had not been activated. Only one thing was certain. This was no accident of the hearth. Behind the elegant veneer of Elmstead Vicarage, a deadly design had been set in motion, and MissMarple would unravel it, piece by careful piece. But first she must preserve this silent scene, for within it lay the very seeds of truth. The gentle tick of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to echo her resolve. Time, she knew, would soon reveal every secret dot in the hush that followed. The village's peaceful veneer cracked forever, and MissMarple prepared to pry open the hidden chambers of motive, deception, and ultimately murder. Chapter 2. The village reacts. News of the tragedy spread through Elmstead like ripples across a still pond. By late afternoon, villagers paused in their routines, glancing toward the vicarage gates with hushed curiosity. The once familiar landscape, neat rose beds, manicured hedges, and winding gravel paths, felt tainted by suspicion. Under the honeyed sunlight, the clue-strewn hearth of Elmstead Vicarage had transformed into a tableau of terror that none could ignore. MissMarple remained in the library, preserving the scene with quiet solemnity. Reverend Lavington had summoned Dr. Kempthorne, whose black motor car rattled up the drive 10 minutes after the discovery. But outside the vicarage walls, conversations took on a breathless urgency. Mrs. Doreen Pritchard, proprietor of the village bakery, was the first to arrive at the hedgerow of onlookers. She clutched her flour-dusted apron and glanced repeatedly at the locked library window. "Can you believe it?" she murmured to Mrs. Edith Whittaker, the postmistress. "Poor Violet Such. A life and spirit. How could this happen here?" Edith's prim expression faltered. "It's unthinkable. But I heard she was carrying on with someone in Marston last evening. Perhaps a scorned lover?" Mrs. Pritchard harumphed. "Nonsense. Violet's too cheerful for secrets. I reckon it's family business. Those Granhams always had quarrels, under their polished manners." By the time Lady Stretton drove up in her pale blue touring car, the small crowd had swelled. Among them was Mr. Gregory Nash, the local solicitor, who offered a calm hand to steady Mrs. Pritchard's trembling shoulder. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he advised, voice low. "The vicarage is private property. Best we let the authorities handle it." Behind the gate, MissMarple noted each movement. She observed Mrs. Pritchard's anxious fingernails against her apron, Edith Whittaker's pursed lips, and the solemn posture of Gregory Nash. Their reactions formed a mosaic of motive and opportunity, each an inkblot on the canvas of the mystery dot inside. Dr. Kempthorne rose from his examination of Violet Grantham's body with a grave expression. He brushed ash from his tweed coat and addressed the assembled household. "Miss Grantham is alive, though the wound is serious. It appears to be a stab wound inflicted with a thin, sharp instrument, possibly a stiletto or ornate letter opener." He paused, eyeing the matchstick still clenched in Violet's hand. The presence of the burnt match suggests the assailant intended to conceal evidence by setting a small fire, though it failed to spread. A collective gasp followed. Even Mrs. Fawcett's stern composure cracked. Reverend Lavington's face, ashen, stepped forward. Surely such a crime could not be premeditated in this peaceful village. Dr. Kempthorne shook his head. "I cannot yet rule out deliberation. The locked room indicates someone knew how to bypass the vicarage's security. We must consider everyone present this afternoon." His gaze fell on MissMarple. "You organized the gathering, MissMarple?" She inclined her head. "I simply accepted Reverend Lavington's invitation. And you, Lady Stretton, Mrs. Cole, Mr. Harrington, each of you must provide your account of events." He signaled to Mrs. Fawcett. "Please fetch refreshments for our guests. We shall require tea while we question them." Outside, the villagers had drifted away, some returning to their chores, others whispering in the village green. The tension lingered like a shadow across Elmstead's cobblestones. By early evening, the postmistress had locked her doors, and even the pub's usual clamor was muted. At 6 o'clock sharp, Reverend Lavington's dinner bell rang. In the paneled dining room, a single long table was laid with simple fare: roast chicken, buttered peas, and a loaf of crusty bread. Yet the convivial warmth typically associated with the vicarage homecoming was absent. The guests gathered more, out of obligation than fellowship. MissMarple sat at the head of the table, nearest the library door. To her right were Lady Stretton and Mrs. Cole. To her left, Mr. Harrington and Gregory Nash. Mrs. Fawcett hovered behind, ready to refill teacups or remove empty plates. The soft glow of candlelight lent the room a somber intimacy. Reverend Lavington cleared his throat. "I know this evening's. Circumstances are dire, but perhaps a light meal will steady nerves. If you would each recount your whereabouts and observations, we may find clarity." Lady Stretton, impeccably dressed though her expression was strained, began. "I arrived early this morning to call on your dear niece, Reverend. After tea, I retired to the drawing-room to review invitations for the upcoming garden fete. I scarcely noticed anything amiss until Mrs. Fawcett's alarm." Her voice was measured, but the slight quiver betrayed her composure. Mrs. Cole, whose dark attire bore no ornamentation beyond a simple locket, spoke next. "I was tending to some correspondence in the study upstairs. I thought I heard voices, and the garden laughter perhaps before a sudden silence. Then I heard Mrs. Fawcett call from below. Her gloved hands clasped and unclasped, leaving faint indentations in her lap. Gregory Nash adjusted his spectacles. I arrived to deliver a letter to the vicarage. The maid showed me into the drawing-room, where I waited for a few moments. I heard Reverend Lavington announce tea, and then nothing until the commotion. Mr. Harrington, his once imposing posture now slightly hunched, spoke in a low tone. I was just outside the woodlands, checking traps. I heard MissMarple and Mrs. Fawcett in the hall below, so I joined them. I did not see anyone else enter or leave the library." Reverend Lavington nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you. Now, MissMarple?" She folded her lace handkerchief calmly. I settled in the drawing-room for tea and observed everyone's interactions. I spoke briefly with Violet Grantham about her upcoming appointment in Marston. She seemed in high spirits, no indication of fear or agitation. She paused, studying each face. But it was in the library, just moments before tea, that all was altered. Dr. Kempthorne interjected. "The wound indicates a swift thrust, angled from below. The match suggests arson by proxy. We must consider motive. Was it passion, jealousy, or revenge?" Silence fell. Each guest exchanged glances. Their comfortable roles lady of title, village widow, gamekeeper, solicitor strained by suspicion. Reverend Lavington broke the hush. "Tomorrow I shall inform Scotland Yard, but tonight we are all here. Let us rest and reflect." After dinner, Lady Stretton offered to help clear the table. Mrs. Fawcett demurred, retreating instead to the kitchen. In the hallway, MissMarple intercepted Lady Stretton. "Your ladyship seemed quite eager to discuss Marston invitations," she observed softly. Lady Stretton's lips tightened. "Merely small talk, MissMarple. One must distract oneself in unsettling times." MissMarple nodded, her gaze lingering on the jeweled brooch at Edith's throat, a rare family heirloom, rumored to have been bequeathed to someone outside the official will. A minor detail, perhaps, but enough to pique her curiosity. Later, as candles flickered low, the vicarage corridors grew quiet. Mrs. Cole retired early, claiming fatigue. Gregory Nash excused himself to draft notes by lamplight. Mr. Harrington wandered into the garden as if seeking solace among the rose bushes. Only Miss Marple and Dr. Kempthorne remained near the hearth. Dr. Kempthorne studied the burnt matchstick again. Curious that the match is English-made, not foreign. Whoever planned this intended it as an indicator, a message perhaps. Ember, blood, match, symbols pointing to something. Miss Marple's fingers traced the rim of her teacup, or someone attempted misdirection. In my experience, the simplest explanation, or the most theatrical, is rarely the true one. Dr. Kempthorne offered a tired smile. Then we shall leave theatrics to the murderers and seek the facts. Miss Marple returned his smile with a serene nod. Indeed, but the village is awash with stories already. We must wade through them with care. As the grandfather clock chimed 10, the library door creaked shut, and the household drifted to uneasy sleep. Outside, Elmstead's thatched cottages lay silent, their inhabitants dreaming of security, now shattered by one fatal strike. And in the hush of the vicarage, Miss Marple sat poised, each thought a careful stitch in the tapestry of truth she was determined to reveal. Chapter 3. Early investigation. The following morning dawned pale and overcast, a thin mist curling around the gabled rooftops of Elmstead. Inside the vicarage, footsteps echoed in the broad hallway as Miss Marple moved from room to room, her keen gray eyes absorbing each detail. The hush in the house was heavier than sleep itself, an atmosphere charged with unspoken questions. At breakfast in the sunlit morning room, Reverend Lavington poured porridge for Mrs. Fawcett, who wore a worried expression. The vicar himself spoke quietly to Dr. Kempthorne about Violet's condition. She slept fitfully, the doctor reported, stirring his tea. I've dressed the wound and given her rest. I expect she'll regain full consciousness by midday. He glanced toward the door. With any luck, we'll have her account of events soon. Miss Marple acknowledged him with a slight nod, then turned her attention to the hearth. Though cleaned overnight, she could still just discern the faintest smudge of ash near the grate's edge, a ghost of last night's attempted conflagration. She made a mental note to examine the fireplace tools later. The tongs and poker lay in their customary positions, yet she suspected a careful hand had manipulated them after the fact. Across the table, Lady Stretton sipped her tea with impeccable poise, though the flush in her cheeks suggested sleepless nights. Mrs. Cole nibbled dry toast, eyes downcast, and Gregory Nash reviewed his notebook. Mr. Harrington, in tweed and cap, ate sparingly and stared at the window, as if expecting Violet's imminent return. Miss Marple cleared her throat. I think it would be most helpful if we each revisit our movements from yesterday morning. Perhaps small inconsistencies will emerge. She paused, letting the suggestion sink in. If you don't mind, I shall begin. Everyone looked at her expectantly. She smiled gently. After tea, I returned to the drawing room to discuss the fete invitations. I recall seeing Lady Stretton examining one of the pamphlets at the table, and indeed the papers were slightly crumpled afterward, as though moved hastily. She folded her napkin. Then I heard voices from the corridor. Mrs. Fawcett and Miss Grantham. I believe before you called us in, Reverend. Lady Stretton inclined her head. That is correct. She patted the invitation she still held. I was considering whether to propose adding a musical interlude to the program. Violet thought it a splendid idea. Miss Marple turned Mrs. Cole. "And you, dear Mrs. Cole?" Mrs. Cole pressed her lips together. "I was in the study, writing letters. I left the French window ajar. I remember the breeze rustling the curtains. I thought of going to the garden to fetch lavender for my correspondence. But then tea was announced." She exhaled. "I did not step outside." Gregory Nash cleared his throat. "I arrived about 3:15. The maid showed me to the drawing-room, and I waited with Lady Stretton until Reverend Lavington fetched tea. I did not go near the library." Mr. Harrington shifted in his seat. "I was checking traps at the woodland's edge, as I said. I heard the tea announcement and came straight here." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Mrs. Fawcett, you were with Violet in the library?" The housekeeper nodded, her apron folded neatly before her. "Yes, Miss Marple. Violet asked me for matches. She wanted to light a small fire in the grate before tea, to chase away the lingering dampness from last night's rain. We chatted while I lit the embers." Her hands trembled slightly at the memory. "I left her for just a moment to fetch milk from the scullery. When I returned—" She stopped, eyes brimming. "And you found her slumped in the chair." Miss Marple finished gently. "Thank you, Mrs. Fawcett. That was most helpful." Dr. Kempthorne, who had remained silent until now, leaned forward. "Miss Marple, may I accompany you to the library? There are details I should point out before the staff disturb anything further." She smiled. "Certainly, Doctor." They traversed the corridor together, passing the closed door of Violet's room, from which muffled breathing and the slow hiss of the nurse's whispers drifted. In the library, Dr. Kempthorne gestured to the fireplace. "Notice the smear." "Along the lintel," he said, pointing to a faint gray streak above the mantelpiece. "It's fresh ash. Not soot applied by hand, I suspect." Miss Marple knelt, inspecting the hearth closely. The stones were cool, but the ash remained loosely clinging to a few crevices. She snagged a thin wooden splinter from between the stones. "A tool must have been inserted here to scrape embers," she murmured. "Perhaps the poker was used as a makeshift scraper." Dr. Kempthorne frowned. "But why go to the trouble?" "The fire was small, hardly enough to destroy any evidence." "Intent," Miss Marple replied. She ran a gloved finger along the edge of the fireplace grate, a display to divert attention. She stood and surveyed the room. Rows of bookshelves lined the walls. On the corner shelf stood a small brass statuette of St. Michael, previously unnoticed. "Doctor, do you recall if this statuette was here last evening?" He hesitated. "I cannot say. I did not pay it particular mind." Miss Marple retrieved it and examined its base. The underside bore fresh scuff marks, as though it had been pried off its usual spot. Someone rummaged here, no doubt seeking something or hiding evidence. She returned it to the shelf, slightly askew. They turned at the sound of footsteps. Gregory Nash entered, notebook in hand. "Miss Marple, Doctor, I thought you might want this." He presented a folded scrap of paper. Unfolding it gently, Miss Marple recognized the hastily scrawled handwriting, a fragment of color ember, followed by "Here, the rest torn away." She smoothed it on the desk. Someone wrote ember and began heart. Perhaps hearth. The torn edge suggests a larger note once existed. Dr. Kempthorne tapped his chin. "A clue, certainly, but planted or genuine?" Miss Marple's eyes glinted. That is what we must determine. She looked at Nash. Where did you find this? In the drawing room, under the settee, he said. I was moving cushions to check for stray tea crumbs. MissMarple nodded thoughtfully. Thank you. Please, place it in the evidence envelope. And if you would, ask Mrs. Fawcett to catalog the fireplace tools, note their positions and any scratches or chips. As Nash departed, MissMarple turned back to Dr. Kempthorne. The best mysteries are like tangled skeins. Each strand seems random until woven together. He smiled wryly. Then we have much unraveling ahead of us. They left the library, and MissMarple chose to walk the corridors alone. She paused outside Violet's door, where she overheard the nurse softly coaxing her patient. Inside, Violet Grantham stirred, her pale face creased with confusion. Returning to the hallway landing, MissMarple considered her next step. She would speak to the stable hand, perhaps inspect the garden gate, and certainly revisit Lady Stretton's touring car. Each lead was small, yet in these fragments lay the shape of truth. At midday, having paused only to replenish her tea, MissMarple descended the grand staircase and entered the garden. The dew-laden grass sparkled, and the rose-bush lifted their scintillating heads. Mr. Harrington was there, pacing beside the pond. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrington," she called gently. He turned, removing his cap in deference. "MissMarple." His voice was quieter now, wearier. "I wondered if I might see the traps you mentioned," she said. "I confess I know little of woodcraft, and your expertise might illuminate something." He hesitated, then nodded. "Certainly. They lie just beyond the far hedge." He led her through a narrow arch to a thicket where simple snares hung from gnarled branches. MissMarple studied them, neat, precise loops of cord. No sign of disturbance. "You check these daily?" "Every morning. And yesterday, early in the morning. Before I came here." She studied his earnest expression. "And you saw no one entering the woods?" "No one." She peered through the hedge. "Then the library must have been accessed from inside." "A window latch, perhaps?" Harrington shrugged. "They're secured." MissMarple gave a small nod. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington." She straightened and headed back toward the house, her mind racing by the time she reached the terrace. Violet Grantham's voice drifted through the open library window. "Where am I? What happened?" MissMarple paused, her resolve firm. The early investigation had only deepened the mystery. Clues flickered like embers, refusing to reveal their warmth until carefully tended. And so, with gentle purpose, she prepared for the next phase, drawing closer to the heart of deceit, yet mindful that any misstep could extinguish the light. Of Truth Forever, Chapter 4. First suspects by mid-afternoon, the calm corridors of Elmstead Vicarage had been transformed into a hive of whispered interrogations and furtive glances. Inspector Barnaby of Scotland Yard arrived with deliberate composure, his polished boots echoing on the hallway's stone floor. Though he wore the uniform of a metropolitan detective, his sharp eyes and quiet demeanor bespoke a mind accustomed to uncovering hidden truths. MissMarple welcomed him in the drawing-room, where the afternoon light slanted through lace curtains. The inspector offered a polite nod. "MissMarple, Dr. Kempthorne has briefed me. I understand you've been overseeing this early investigation." She inclined her head gracefully. "Yes, Inspector. I thought it best to gather everyone here before the formal questioning began. He studied the assembled party, Reverend Lavington gaunt with worry, Lady Stretton, her posture impeccably straight, though her eyes flickered with fatigue, Mrs. Cole, ever demure in widow's black, Mr. Harrington, whose gaze remained fixed on the distant rose garden, Gregory Nash, pen poised over a fresh page of notes, and Mrs. Fawcett, silent as a sentinel near the tea service. "Thank you," Barnaby said. "I will first speak with Miss Grantham, now recovered enough to give an account. Afterwards I will question each of you in turn. Miss Marple, would you join me?" She rose and followed him through the corridor, pausing at Violet's door. Inside, the nurse stepped aside to reveal Violet Grantham, propped against crisp pillows, pale but alert. The faint bloom of color had returned to her cheeks, though her hand trembled as she grasped the matchstick on her bedside table. "Miss Grantham," Barnaby began gently, "can you tell me exactly what happened yesterday afternoon?" Violet swallowed, her voice soft, yet steady. I asked Mrs. Fawcett to light the fire. It felt chilly in the library after that morning's rain. When she left to fetch milk, I remained selecting a book from the shelf, something to read before tea. I remember the book slipped from my hand, and I bent to retrieve it. Then pain, a sudden stab, and everything went dark. Barnaby made a note. "Did you see anyone in the room? Hear a voice?" She hesitated. "No, it was so quick. I remember the scrape of metal on the hearth, and someone's breath as though they leaned close." "Thank you," he said softly. "Rest now." They withdrew, and Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on Violet's arm before departing. Outside the room, Barnaby's expression grew contemplative. "An attack from behind, then?" he murmured. "Very deliberate." He led Miss Marple into the study, where a small table held the torn fragment. "Ember here?" And the evidence envelope. The inspector eyed the paper. "Intriguing. Could be a note interrupted. But I suspect this crime was planned with personal motive." "I agree," Miss Marple replied. "Yet the theatrical embers scene also suggests misdirection." Barnaby nodded. "Which brings me to the guests. The first suspect, naturally, is the person with the greatest opportunity. Lady Stretton, you were seen lingering near that very shelf in the drawing-room." He looked over his spectacles. "Mrs. Fawcett observed you examining invitations, but Miss Marple noted those invitations were crumpled afterward, as if hastily put away." Lady Stretton's eyes widened. She smoothed the folds of her skirt. "The invitations were heavy cardstock. I confessed earlier that I moved them. I had no reason to conceal them." Barnaby turned to Mrs. Cole. "Mrs. Cole, you were upstairs." "In the study. Yet you claim to have heard laughter outside." "The windows in the library and study face the same garden. How could you distinguish voices?" Mrs. Cole's lips trembled. I thought it was Violet speaking with Mrs. Fawcett. Perhaps I was mistaken." The inspector's gaze settled on Gregory Nash. "And Mr. Nash, the solicitor, you found the note under the settee?" The word hearth torn away. It could implicate someone familiar with this very fireplace. "I believe you might have planted it to divert suspicion from your own knowledge of the vicarage." Gregory Nash stiffened, his pen falling. "Inspector, I assure you I did no such thing. I merely moved cushions. I had not been in the drawing-room since delivering my letter." Barnaby frowned. Yet your familiarity with the building suggests you know its secret passages. There is a back corridor from the study to the library disabled only recently. He turned to Mr. Harrington. Mr. Harrington, you say you came directly from the woods after hearing tea called. But you have seen these corridors. Did you not notice me exit the study through the servants' corridor? Harrington's stiff jaw relaxed. I did, sir. I assumed you were a servant fetching something. Barnaby's lips curved in a half-smile. A clever assumption. Yet it places you at the scene unobserved. He paused, leaning on the desk. Reverend Lavington, do you have any visitors who arrived unaccompanied yesterday? The vicar's face went pale. Only my niece, Violet, and our guests. No one else entered. Barnaby closed his notebook. So our chief suspects in order are Lady Stretton for her odd movements, Mrs. Cole for possible overhearing, Mr. Nash for his knowledge of vicarage secrets, and Mr. Harrington for his unobtrusive presence. A hush fell. Lady Stretton straightened. Surely you need more evidence than mere presence? He inclined his head. Of course. But in a locked room scenario, opportunity is paramount. Motive we shall next examine. At that moment, the door opened. Mrs. Fawcett appeared, holding a tray. Barnaby beckoned her forward. Mrs. Fawcett, you know every corner of this house. Did you notice anything missing from the library? She swallowed. No, sir. Apart from the statuette of St. Michael, it was slightly askew, and the poker seemed to rest closer to the hearth than when I left it. MissMarple caught the inspector's eye. A slight nod affirmed her earlier suspicions. Barnaby scribbled furiously. He closed his notebook with a decisive snap. Thank you, Mrs. Fawcett. I believe I have enough to proceed with formal statements. You are all to remain within the vicarage until I have spoken with each of you in turn. He laid a calming hand on Lady Stretton's arm. I know this is distressing, but I'll be thorough. MissMarple, I'd appreciate your continued assistance. MissMarple inclined her head. Whatever you require, Inspector. As Barnaby departed to summon the constable for individual interviews, the room's tension lingered. Each suspect exchanged uneasy glances. Lady Stretton smoothed her skirts. Mrs. Cole clutched her locket. Nash adjusted his spectacles. Harrington fingered his cap's brim. MissMarple remained calm, but her mind whirled with competing theories. The inspector's focus on opportunity had cast suspicion widely, yet she sensed the true culprit lay hidden behind more subtle motives. Resentment. Secrecy, perhaps a long-buried grievance. With the first suspects identified, the case would now turn inward, probing personal histories and unearthing buried scandals. And MissMarple, undeterred by the inspector's by-the-book approach, prepared to follow her own observations into the intricate web of motive and alibi that enfolded Elmstead Vicarage. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. Late afternoon settled over Elmstead Vicarage with a muted hush, broken only by the distant toll of the church bell and the measured steps of Inspector Barnaby as he conducted his separate interviews. One by one, the guests were led away. Lady Stretton to the study, Mrs. Cole to the drawing room, Mr. Harrington to the library, and Gregory Nash to the vicarage office. Reverend Lavington retreated to his private quarters to pray and compose. Himself, Mrs. Fawcett hovered in the corridors, her apron crisply starched, but her hands trembling ever so slightly. Amid this controlled chaos, MissMarple remained in the sunroom, sipping a cup of chamomile tea and gazing out at the rose garden. The detective's mind churned with impressions from the earlier questioning. Lady Stretton's taut silence, Mrs. Cole's uncertain memory, Nash's scholarly defensiveness, and Harrington's restless anxiety. They all bore traces of guilt, some more convincing than others. But MissMarple knew that the true evidence often lay in the minutiae overlooked by those who sought only dramatic proof. As she set down her teacup, her eyes fell on the mantelpiece beside her. There, perched among framed photographs of village fetes and charity bazaars, stood a small porcelain vase painted with sprigs of lavender. MissMarple glanced about the room. The vase was the sole piece of china, not a family heirloom, merely a decorative trinket, but its presence felt discordant. Elmstead Vicarage was furnished with modest, sturdy items. The lavender vase belonged more fittingly to Lady Stretton's elegant drawing-room than to the warm, homely sunroom. She rose and approached it. A faint scratch marred the vase's base, as though someone had slid it hurriedly across the wood to conceal an underlying blemish. Turning it in her gloved hands, she discovered a barely perceptible smudge of ash along the rim, ash that could not have come from last night's hearth, which burned coal rather than wood. This dusty residue was lighter, more fibrous, reminiscent of paper rather than embers. MissMarple placed the vase back exactly as she'd found it and paused, closing her eyes to gather her thoughts. Paper ash, a crumpled note hidden in the sunroom. But what message could someone have concealed here? She would need to examine the chairs, the settee cushions, and perhaps even the carpet for telltale scraps. Leaving her tea untouched, she walked across the polished floor toward the French windows. Through them she could see Mr. Harrington pacing the library terrace, exchange of harried glances with Mrs. Fawcett as she delivered tea to the inspector. Driven by instinct, MissMarple crossed the room and stepped outside. "Mr. Harrington," she called softly. He halted, doffing his cap. "MissMarple." His tone was respectful, but wary. "I wonder if I might trouble you with a question." She inclined her head. "Earlier you mentioned that the library window latches were secure, yet ash and soot can drift on the breeze. Have you ever seen wind-borne ash settle inside the vicarage?" He blinked. "To be honest, I never gave it thought. I was never inside in windy weather." She studied his face. "Do you recall when you first arrived yesterday? Any unusual smell in the air? Smoke, perhaps, or burning paper?" He hesitated. "Now that you mention it, yes. A faint, singed scent, nothing like wood smoke. More like parchment or old letters burning." MissMarple's eyes brightened. "Precisely. That would explain the ash on the vase. Someone burned a note and hid the remnants here in the sunroom." She paused, her gaze drifting to the rose garden beyond. "And yet they chose not to carry it away or dispose of it more thoroughly, likely because they were interrupted." He frowned. "By tea, you mean? Or by an unexpected visitor?" "Perhaps Mrs. Fawcett." MissMarple offered a gentle smile. "She stepped away from your companion, Dr. Kempthorne, only briefly. Enough for someone to hide a secret. Harrington's." Eyes flickered to the vicarage doors. "You think it was one of us who hid it?" "Quite so," she replied. "But we must recover it first." They re-entered the sunroom, and MissMarple began her search. She knelt before the fireplace hearth, fortunately swept clean by Dr. Kempthorne's order, and brushed aside loose specks of ash. Beneath the grate she found a single thin strip of paper, curled and brittle. Carefully retrieving it, she examined the words, "Secret lies beneath the embers." Her heart quickened. Ember, hearth, secret. The words echoed the fragment finder's torn note. Ember here. Now she held the missing piece, a caution left by someone, perhaps the killer or the victim, alerting to the significance of the hearth itself. But what does it mean? She murmured, smoothing the jagged edges. Was Violet Grantham attempting to reveal her assailant? Or was it a red herring, planted to confuse? Either way, the note directed Miss Marple's attention back to the very heart of the crime scene. Mr. Harrington leaned over her shoulder, whispering, "Should we show this to Inspector Barnaby?" She shook her head. "Not yet. He will want to keep suspects separate until formal charges are made. We must investigate further gently, without alarming anyone." She rose and handed the paper strip to him, instructing, "Seal this in. Envelope, but do not mention its contents to the others. Then fetch the poker and tongs for my inspection." While he complied, returning with the fireplace tools propped upright, Miss Marple surveyed the room. Her gaze landed on the portrait of Reverend Lavington's late wife. The frame, like the vase, was misaligned, tilted slightly to the right, as though someone had brushed by it in haste. A small beam of daylight struck the picture at an odd angle, revealing a thin crack radiating from the lower corner of the frame. Behind it, the wallpaper bore a faint discoloration, an outline perhaps of a hidden compartment. Intrigued, Miss Marple touched the frame. It gave way with a soft click. A narrow cavity appeared, containing a small wooden box. She lifted it gently and opened the lid. Inside lay a folded slip of paper. Violet's handwriting, neat and precise, reading, "For when the truth must be stoked, but beware the fiery smile of betrayal." Miss Marple's breath caught. Violet Grantham. It seemed had suspected something before her attack, or perhaps someone warned her. The poetic riddle seemed to confirm that the hearth violence was symbolic, drawing attention to the fireplace as the locus of deceit. She closed the box and replaced everything with meticulous care. When Mr. Harrington returned, he presented the poker and tongs, which she examined under the fading light. The poker bore a microscopic nick near its tip, a fresh mark that could only have come from forceful use, perhaps pushing aside a concealed latch or scraping at wood. The tongs, however, showed no new blemishes. Miss Marple straightened, her eyes alight. The poker was used twice, once to set the scene, and once to uncover the secret behind the portrait. She folded her hands thoughtfully. Only someone who knew of this hidden compartment and of Violet's intentions could have orchestrated both actions. Harrington leaned closer. "Do you think Violet discovered the compartment before she was attacked?" "It seems so. She went to retrieve a book and stumbled upon something far more personal." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the portrait, where the Reverend's wife smiled serenely from her gilded frame. A secret she chose not to keep. That secret cost her dearly. She tucked both slips of paper into her reticule. Now we must learn what lay in that box before Violet moved it, and why someone wanted to hide it. The next step is to question Mrs. Fawcett and perhaps examine the Reverend's study more closely. But first we must conceal our discovery until the proper moment. Mr. Harrington nodded, equally grave and eager. Outside, the church clock chimed 6, and the sun dipped below the elms. Within the vicarage walls, a hidden clue had illuminated a path through the embers of mystery, a path only Miss Marple could follow, one careful step at a time. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Late evening had settled over Elmstead Vicarage, casting long shadows across the polished floors and lending a muted hush to the corridors. Miss Marple lingered in the library foyer, her senses alert to the slightest stir. The household was mostly retired misses. Cole and Lady Stretton had withdrawn early, claiming weariness after the day's events. Gregory Nash was penning notes in the study. Mr. Harrington had excused himself to rest in the servants' wing, and Reverend Lavington, weary and pale, had retreated to his private study. Only Mrs. Fawcett remained on duty, her footsteps soft against the hallway runner. Miss Marple intercepted the housekeeper at the foot of the grand staircase. "Mrs. Fawcett," she said gently, "might I have a word in private?" Mrs. Fawcett's starched apron quivered as she curtsied. "Of course, Miss Marple." She paused, smoothing her hands. "Forgive me if I seem distracted." They moved into the kitchen, its warm lamplight a stark contrast to the library's cold opulence. On the work table lay covered dishes and a tray of untouched refreshment, left for late-night vigils. Mrs. Fawcett filled a kettle and sighed. "I've observed you carefully today." Miss Marple began, pouring 2 cups of tea. "You know this house intimately. I wonder if there is anything you noticed, perhaps something you dismissed at the time that now seems significant?" Mrs. Fawcett accepted the tea with a trembling hand. She stirred sugar absently. "It's just, this place holds many memories. Miss Marple, I have served the vicarage for 30 years. I know its sounds, its smells, its secrets." She met Miss Marple's steady gaze. "Yesterday, before the tea, I heard raised voices from the study. It sounded like the vicar arguing with someone, hushed but urgent. I paused at the door but dared not enter." "Do you recall what you heard?" The housekeeper hesitated. "Only fragments. Cannot risk this coming to light." And then a soft sob. "I'm certain it was Lady Stretton." Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted. "So Lady Stretton was in private conversation with the Reverend?" Mrs. Fawcett nodded. "It struck me as odd. Later I saw Lady Stretton slip past me toward the drawing-room, face pale as a sheet. She wrapped her hands tighter around her tea. I thought it was grief for Miss Grantham, but now—" Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Very good, Mrs. Fawcett. Your ear for those hushed tones may prove vital." She set down the cup. "Thank you. You may return to rest shortly. I shall handle matters now." Mrs. Fawcett inclined her head and slipped away, her footsteps fading. Miss Marple rose and made her way to the Reverend's study, wondering what the night might reveal. The study door was ajar, a sliver of lamplight spilling into the dark hallway. Inside, the Reverend sat at his mahogany desk, head bowed over a sheaf of papers. He looked up as she entered. "Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat, "I did not expect you." "I hope I'm not intruding," she replied. "I merely wished to glance at some of your correspondence, if you will allow it." Reverend Lavington's hand trembled slightly as he set aside his quill. "Certainly." He moved a pile of letters to one side. "These are private. You must promise." "Discretion. I understand," she said softly. He gestured to a chair. As she sat, she surveyed the desk, open ledgers, a crimson blot of wax beside a half-written letter, and, curiously, 2 envelopes bearing Lady Stretton's embossed monogrammed dot. She picked up the uppermost envelope and broke its seal. Inside was a typed letter signed by Lady Stretton, requesting the postponement of Violet Random's inheritance reading due to sensitive family matters. The content seemed innocuous until Miss Marple noticed an additional handwritten note in the margin. "Better she never hears the truth." Her heart quickened. The phrase echoed the earlier clue, "Secret lies beneath the embers," but now suggested that someone intended to hide vital information from Violet. She laid the letter aside and opened the second envelope. It contained correspondence between Reverend Lavington and a solicitor in London regarding the late Mrs. Lavington's will. A specific clause had been contested before her death concerning a hidden bequest. Violet, as next of kin, stood to benefit, but the clause had been quietly removed from published copies of the will. Miss Marple folded her hands. "Reverend, this clause, was it removed recently?" He swallowed. "Years ago. My late wife preferred discretion, certain things best left unspoken." His voice broke. "It named Violet as beneficiary of a small fund to support her education. I agreed to her wishes. A fund that Violet might not know exists." Miss Marple tapped the letter from Lady Stretton. "Yet someone hopes she never learned of it." He bowed his head. "Please, none of this must distress Violet further." Miss Marple rose. "Certainly, but these papers belong in the evidence collection." She tucked the letters into her reticule. "Thank you for your candor." Back in the corridor, she paused to collect her thoughts. The tangled web of family intrigue had deepened. Not merely jealousy over a suitor, but a hidden inheritance and a desire to suppress it. She resolved to speak next with Lady Stretton herself. Making her way to the drawing room, she found Lady Stretton seated by the window, gazing at the darkened rose garden. The room was colder than she remembered, and the silver samovar gleamed ghostly in the lamplight. "Your ladyship," Miss Marple said, entering. Lady Stretton started, smoothing her skirts. "Miss Marple, I thought everyone was in bed." Miss Marple closed the door softly. "I wondered if you would speak with me. I have questions about your correspondence with Reverend Lavington." Lady Stretton's blush deepened. I wrote only to ensure Violet's affairs were managed discreetly." Miss Marple seated herself across from her. "Yet you wrote. Better she never hears the truth." "That is a strong sentiment. To what truth did you refer?" Lady Stretton's fingers trembled on her lap. She looked away. "My late husband and I, we had debts, substantial ones. When I learned Violet stood to inherit, I feared she would squander it, perhaps uncover financial ruin. I asked the Reverend to defer the reading until matters were resolved." Miss Marple's gaze was gentle. "So your motive was protection?" Tears glistened in Lady Stretton's eyes. "Yes, but I never intended harm. I loved Violet. She was a friend." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I believe you. Yet your words suggest you would go to great lengths to keep that secret. Did you confront Violet when she discovered the will?" Lady Stretton shook her head. "No, I ran when she came upon the papers. I feared her disappointment." Silence settled between them before Miss Marple rose. "Thank you for your honesty. I shall speak no more of this unless necessary." "Lady?" Stretton exhaled, relief and guilt warring in her features. As Miss Marple left, she realized the secret of the will did little to explain the violence at the hearth. She must also consider Mrs. Cole and Gregory Nash. She paused outside Mrs. Cole's door. The widow lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Gathering her resolve, MissMarple knocked lightly. "Come in." Mrs. Cole's voice was wary. MissMarple entered and offered a comforting smile. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I merely wish to share what I've learned and perhaps hear your thoughts." Mrs. Cole sat up, smoothing her gowns. "I suppose I should be braced for gossip." Miss Marple placed the letters before her. "Did you know about Violet's inheritance?" Lady Stretton feared she would never learn of it. Mrs. Cole's eyes widened. "No, I had no idea. I saw Violet receive letters, but assumed them general correspondence." She paused, touching the locket at her throat. "My husband died penniless. If I had known of such a fund, I might have—" Her voice faltered. MissMarple watched her closely. "Might have asked Violet for help?" Tears brimmed. "Yes, but I would never harm her." MissMarple offered a nod of understanding. "Thank you. Sometimes knowing a secret is the first step toward understanding motive." Leaving Mrs. Cole to her reflections, MissMarple felt the weight of hidden resentments pressing upon her. Fueled by fear, guilt, and protection, the vicarage's inhabitants harbored secrets capable of inciting violence. Yet one final revelation remained to be uncovered, one that would bind these disparate motives into a coherent truth. She returned to the library, where the poker and the torn notes lay waiting. In the silent gloom, she arranged them on the desk and allowed herself a single, steadying breath. Outside, the church clock tolled midnight. Within the vicarage, the stage was set for the next confession and for Miss Marple's subtle orchestration of justice. Chapter 7. Another twist. The hush of midnight had given way to the fragile stillness of early morning as Elmstead Vicarage lay under moonlit shadows. Behind heavy draperies, the library's dark silhouette stood sentinel against the pale sky. MissMarple, unable to sleep, found herself drawn once more to the scene of the crime. In her reticule rested the torn notes. Ember here, and secret lies beneath the embers, and the varnished poker, its nicked tip a testament to hidden labors. She lit a single lamp at her usual desk, the mellow glow illuminating the scattered clues. Footsteps at the far end of the corridor alerted her. It was Gregory Nash, turning the knob of the study door with deliberate care. He paused when he saw MissMarple, offering a courteous bow. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he murmured. "Not at all," she replied, gesturing to the chair opposite. "I find the quiet of the night conducive to thought." He seated himself, smoothing his jacket. "I've been reviewing my notes and find an inconsistency I cannot ignore." He tapped his notebook. "You recall, I never entered the library after delivering my letter. Yet I claimed to find the scrap under the drawing room settee. I've since discovered no one else had access to that settee but me." His voice trembled. "I'm afraid my own misplacement may have created a false trail." MissMarple regarded him kindly. "An honest mistake can occur under distress. It does not suggest ill intent." Gregory exhaled, leaning back. "Thank you, but I must confess I've been unsettled by the hidden box behind the portrait. As a solicitor, I've seen many a secret compartment. That find suggests someone expected its contents to vanish. I fear I may have overlooked its presence in my earlier visits." MissMarple nodded. Only one or two people knew of that compartment: Violet Grantham and her uncle, Lady Stretton. Discovered it last evening by accident. Gregory's brows rose. Lady Stretton, but she claimed ignorance. The letter she penned to defer Violet's inheritance came from that study, MissMarple reminded him. She had consultations. Here, it stands to reason she noticed something amiss. He ran a hand through his hair. Perhaps, but I have another concern. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. I've observed that the poker's nick matches a gouge on the side of the hearth. A slender groove, as though someone forced a tool into the brickwork. He pointed to his sketch, but the groove spirals toward the floor, not upward. Whoever made it did so from below, not while standing, someone of shorter stature or kneeling with care. MissMarple's eyes lit. Mrs. Fawcett, precisely. The height of Violet herself would have worked close to the hearth to tend embers. If someone wished to conceal something beneath the hearthstones, they would adopt that position. Gregory sighed. That implies Mrs. Fawcett. Yet she seems genuinely distraught. She is, MissMarple agreed. But we must keep an open mind until we have all the facts. She closed her notebook. Thank you for your insight, Mr. Nash. You may rest. He rose and left quietly. The silence returned, punctuated only by the gentle ticking of the grandfather. Clock. MissMarple refolded the notes, eyes drawn to the final words. Secret lies beneath the embers. She moved to the fireplace, kneeling once more beneath the grate. With deliberate care, she shifted aside the hearthstones. She had memorized their pattern when first examining the scene. Beneath lay a narrow cavity lined with soot. Inside lay a small metal tin, its lid flecked with ash. Retrieving it, she noted the initials VG engraved on the top. With gloved fingers, she pried it open. Within lay a ribbon-bound packet of letters handwritten in Violet's elegant script, addressed to Reverend Lavington and signed by Violet's own hand. The first letter bore the date 1 week before her arrival. My dear uncle, there is something I must reveal. MissMarple withdrew one letter and unfolded it beneath the lamp. Uncle, I have discovered that there is more to your late wife's legacy than even you have admitted. The clause in the will pertains not only to inheritance, but to matters of reputation. I beg you to reconsider the removal. Lady Stretton's counsel seems driven by fear, not reason. I trust you to judge wisely. Her breath caught. Violet had suspected the will involved more than money, something to protect the family name. MissMarple replaced the letter and inspected the others, noting recurring references to a scandalous liaison and a promise never to speak of it. The correspondence hinted at a dark secret from Mrs. Lavington's youth, one that Violet believed her uncle still sought to bury. The wind sighed through the open window, and MissMarple paused. The timing of Violet's discovery, the hidden letters, the sudden attack, all now formed a mosaic. Someone had motive to silence Violet before she exposed scandal, not merely to hide a financial clause. A soft cough startled her. Standing in the doorway was Mrs. Fawcett, eyes glistening in the lamplight. She held Violet's discarded shawl, a simple linen wrap embroidered with tiny violets. Mrs. Fawcett's apron was neatly pressed, yet strands of hair escaped from her. Cap, MissMarple, I thought you might need this, she said. Extending the shawl. MissMarple accepted it, noticing a faint smear of ash at the hem. Thank you. I was just examining these letters. She held up the tin. Mrs. Fawcett's breath caught. "You found them?" she whispered. Miss Marple covered the tin with a cloth. "Yes, your young mistress concealed her letters here. She feared her uncle's knowledge of her discovery." Tears welled in Mrs. Fawcett's eyes. She spoke of disgrace. The vicar's wife had an affair before marriage with a gentleman from Marston. Lady Stretton found the documents and wrote that letter, begging her uncle to hide the scandal. Violet confronted her promise to reveal all at the fete. Lady Stretton panicked. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. Then Lady Stretton had motive to silence Violet. Mrs. Fawcett pressed her lips together. "I thought I heard Lady Stretton in the study last evening, arguing with the Reverend," she pleaded. "She must not speak at the fete." Then Violet arrived, furious. "I rushed away, and you know the rest." Miss Marple stood, folding her hands. "Thank you, Mrs. Fawcett. You've been most helpful." As the housekeeper retreated, Miss Marple replaced the letters in the tin and slipped it back beneath the hearthstones. She returned to her desk, mind racing. The killer's identity seemed clear, yet she needed confirmation. At dawn, she would confront Lady Stretton, but tonight required strategy. She extinguished the lamp and left the library, closing the door softly behind her. The corridor's lantern cast narrow pools of light, guiding her past portraits of vicarage ancestors, silent witnesses to the unfolding tragedy. In the hush, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Another twist had revealed the true motive, not greed, but fear of disgrace. With the pieces now gathered, the final unraveling of Elmstead's deadly secret would come soon before the morning chimes heralded the fate that Violet would never see. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test. The dawn sky was a wash of pale rose and gray as Elmstead Vicarage stirred to life once more. In the kitchen, Mrs. Fawcett moved with silent precision, brewing tea and arranging scones on a silver platter. The household was tense. Inspector Barnaby was due to resume his interrogations, and Violet Grantham's recovery lingered uncertain. Yet before the formal questioning resumed, Miss Marple had arranged a small gathering in the sunroom, inviting each principal party under the guise of morning tea. Her intention, she confided quietly to the vicar, was to observe them under less formal circumstances. At 9:30, Lady Stretton arrived, her blue traveling cloak clasped at her throat. She smiled politely, but her eyes betrayed weariness. Mrs. Cole followed, black crepe softened into a simple morning dress, while Gregory Nash entered last, adjusting his spectacles and carrying a small notebook for reference. He murmured. Mr. Harrington lingered at the threshold, pausing before stepping inside. Each guest took a seat around the low circular table, the silver tray of pastries between them. Miss Marple stood at the window, gazing serenely at the dew-flecked rose garden. "Thank you all for joining me," she began, her voice gentle but firm. "I thought a simple tea might ease tensions before we proceed. We shall speak little of last night's events. I wish only to share a moment of calm." As she poured the steaming tea, she observed their faces. Lady Stretton's lips were pinched. Mrs. Cole's eyes darted to the teapot. Nash's posture was measured, scholarly, and Harrington's gaze remained distant, as though watching for some unseen cue. Miss Marple handed each a cup, then guided the conversation toward trivialities: the upcoming fete, the unexpected mist, the fine scent of lavender from the vicarage garden. Underneath, however, she watched for subtle cues, an involuntary flinch, a tightening of the fingers, a shift in tone. After several minutes, she set down her cup. "I have a small test, if you will indulge me. I recently discovered a second tin of letters packets of Violet's correspondence hidden beneath the hearthstones. However, before presenting them to Inspector Barnaby, I wish to understand more about their origin. Perhaps you can help me?" She met Lady Stretton's eyes first. "Your ladyship, would you know of any reason Violet might have sealed such letters in metal tins?" Lady Stretton's breath caught. She arranged her glove within her lap, voice controlled. Violet was always careful with her words. Perhaps she feared prying eyes. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "Indeed. And what of you, Mrs. Cole? Do you recall Violet asking for help in hiding anything?" Mrs. Cole hesitated, fingertips drumming the table. "She once asked me to sew a ribbon into her sleeve, something she called a personal token. I thought it odd, but she would not say more." Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you. Mr. Nash, your turn. What insight might a solicitor have into sealed correspondence?" Nash cleared his throat, adjusting his notebook. "In legal matters, one seals documents to ensure confidentiality, especially when reputations are at stake." Harrington glanced at Miss Marple. "And in woodcraft, we seal cracks to prevent draft." His attempt at levity fell flat, but his careful tone suggested he measured each word. Miss Marple allowed herself a small smile. "Very good. Now, one more question. Before Violet's letters were hidden, the hearth was the scene of an attempted fire. The embers were scraped aside to reveal a secret compartment." She paused, watching each face for reaction. "Who among us would have known both of the hidden compartment and Violet's propensity for secret correspondence?" A faint silence rippled through the group. Lady Stretton's hand tightened on her teacup. Mrs. Cole's eyes widened. Nash's lips parted slightly. Harrington's jaw clenched. Miss Marple spoke softly. "Certain, Lo. Not the inspector, to whom none of you mentioned a second tin. Only a household member, or someone who moved within the vicarage unnoticed." She sat, folding her hands. "I proposed this test so that you might reveal yourselves in honest conversation. Pray speak freely. Voluntary confession is always more comforting than forced." Lady Stretton let out a trembling breath. "Miss Marple, I cannot. I only wished to protect Violet from scandal, from heartbreak." Her voice cracked. "I never intended harm." Mrs. Cole touched the widow's arm. "We all did what we thought best." Nash closed his notebook. "I admit I was drawn to the mystery, but I did not know of the second tin until Miss Marple discovered it last night." Harrington stood, voice low. "I did not enter the library again after tea. Yet I saw a shadow by the hearth, as though someone crouched there." Miss Marple regarded each in turn. "Shadows can conceal more than presence. They can shield." "Motive. I believe the person who moved that poker twice, once to scrape embers, once to conceal the tin, is the same one who sought to prevent Violet from revealing her letters." She paused, eyes resting on Lady Stretton. Someone whose fear of disgrace overrode her compassion. Lady Stretton's composure crumbled. Tears brimmed as she rose. "Yes, it was I." A collective gasp rose around the table. Mrs. Cole pressed a hand to her mouth. Nash looked between Miss Marple and Lady Stretton. Harrington's face grew pale. Lady Stretton continued, voice trembling but clear. When I discovered Violet had found the letters revealing the affair of my youth and the clause in the will, I begged her uncle to postpone the reading. But Violet insisted on exposing the truth at the fete to free us all. And I could not bear the humiliation. She closed her eyes. So I went to the library, hoping to destroy the letters in the fire. I scraped aside the embers to find the tin, only to discover the second one. I panicked, struck her, but the matchstick and the tin were my ruin. MissMarple rose and offered her handkerchief. Your confession brings clarity, but violence solves nothing. Lady Stretton accepted the handkerchief, tears falling. I only wanted to protect my family. Outside, the church bells tolled 10. The hush that followed was broken by the measured steps of Inspector Barnaby entering the sunroom. He halted, observing the tear-streaked faces. MissMarple offered him the tin of letters. The case, Inspector resolved. Barnaby bowed his head in respect. Thank you, MissMarple. As he moved to accompany Lady Stretton gently toward the study for formal charges, MissMarple watched the morning light fill the room. The fate would never take place, but in the delicate unfolding of truth and the gentle justice served, the vicarage found its peace once more. Chapter 9. The Reveal by Mid-Morning. Elmstead Vicarage was alive with hushed anticipation. Word had spread that Inspector Barnaby would bring Lady Stretton before the household, and many servants and family friends lingered beyond earshot, curious to witness the resolution of the tragedy. MissMarple, serene and composed in a soft gray gown, had arranged for all principal figures to gather in the drawing-room. The heavy lace curtains were drawn back, admitting the soft glow of sunlight gentle illumination for a moment of truth. Reverend Lavington stood near the mantel, support in the steadying of his hands more than the warmth of his smile. Mrs. Cole and Gregory Nash took seats on the chaise longue, their faces drawn yet attentive. Mr. Harrington, in tweed jacket and neat cap, remained by the window, arms folded, but eyes fixed on the open doorway. Mrs. Fawcett lingered by the tea trolley, glancing anxiously at the assembled group. In the center, facing the room, stood Inspector Barnaby, notebook in hand, and beside him Lady Stretton, pallid and composed, awaiting her moment. MissMarple entered quietly, carrying a small, lacquered box, the evidence tin she had discovered beneath the hearthstones. She set it upon the low table before her, and with a gentle nod to Barnaby, assumed her place beside Lady Stretton. The hush deepened. Even the distant call of birds outside seemed to pause in respect. Thank you all for gathering, MissMarple began, voice soft, yet carrying to every corner. We find ourselves at the culmination of a most distressing series of events. Yet justice and truth demand clarity, and I trust you will bear with me as I recount what transpired. She glanced at Violet Grantham's empty chair, a poignant reminder of the victim's absence. Yesterday afternoon, our dear Violet suffered a grievous injury in this very drawing-room, inflicted in the neighboring library. An attempt was made to disguise the crime with embers, a match, and a theatrical display of fire. But beneath the smoke and soot lay deeper motives tied not only to inheritance, but to fear of disgrace. At this, Lady Stretton's fingers tightened around the frame of her chair. MissMarple turned the lacquered box. First, consider the tin-marked VG discovered concealed under the hearthstones. Inside were letters penned by Violet to her uncle, Reverend Lavington, revealing her discovery of a hidden clause in her late aunt's Will I concerning not only a financial bequest, but a promise of secrecy regarding her aunt's youthful liaison. The clause's exposure threatened to unveil a scandal tied to Mrs. Lavington's past. She lifted the tin's lid and allowed the gathered to glimpse the folded letters. Violet, ever the moral compass, intended to disclose this to vindicate her family's integrity. A commendable impulse, but one that regrettably provoked fear in another. MissMarple opened the lacquered box further, revealing the torn scraps bearing the words "Ember here," and "Secret lies beneath the embers." These notes, she continued, pointed precisely to this fireplace, where the assailant scraped aside the embers to retrieve the tin. Yet a second tin, identical in make, was concealed behind the portrait frame, another repository for Violet's correspondence. Here, too, the embers were disturbed, and the poker bore fresh nicks from prying and scraping. She set down the box and met each suspect's gaze. Only someone intimately familiar with both the compartment and Violet's penchant for secrecy would undertake the double concealment and the arson facade. Her eyes rested on Lady Stretton, and only someone who feared the public revelation of a youthful indiscretion, an indiscretion that, though long past, could still bring shame to a respected family. A tremor passed through Lady Stretton. Inspector Barnaby cleared his throat, but MissMarple raised a slender hand. "Please allow me to finish." She turned to Lady Stretton and spoke gently. "My dear Lady Stretton, you wrote to your uncle, better she never hears the truth, and implored him to postpone the wills. Reading. When you discovered Violet unearthing the letters in this study, you panicked at the thought of disclosure at the forthcoming garden fete." Lady Stretton lowered her eyes, tears welling. MissMarple continued, "You went to the library, match in hand, to burn the letters. You scraped aside the embers in search of one tin unaware. Another rested behind the portrait. When Violet interrupted you, her shocked cry provoked your desperate action. You seized a poker and struck her, hoping the shock and the pretense of fire would conceal your deed." A collective gasp rose as Lady Stretton's face paled. Reverend Lavington pressed a hand to his heart. Mrs. Cole's gloved hand flew to her mouth, and Nash's pen clattered to the floor. Harrington straightened. As though bracing himself, Inspector Barnaby stepped forward. "Lady Stretton, I must ask you to account for that act." His voice was stern yet respectful. Lady Stretton's composure shattered. She rose, voice quivering. "Yes, it was I only sought to protect our family's reputation." She turned to the Reverend. "Ambrose, forgive me. I was afraid." Reverend Lavington advanced, his eyes moist. "Harriet, you must understand. I cared for your honor as much as our shared history." His voice broke. "But violence, I never imagined you capable." MissMarple cleared her throat softly. "Violence is never the answer, dear Lady Stretton. Yet through your confession, the village can heal. Truth, though painful, allows forgiveness and renewal." The inspector gently took Lady Stretton's arm. "Come, madam, we shall take you for a formal statement." As she followed Barnaby, MissMarple addressed the remaining guests. "I trust now that the path of justice and compassion have been charted. Let us support Violet's recovery and in time reconcile what can be reconciled." Mrs. Fawcett stepped forward, curtsying respectfully. Miss Marple, you have saved our vicarage from ruin." Miss Marple offered a modest nod. "I have merely illuminated the truth. The strength of Elmstead rests in its hearts and its capacity for understanding." The group dispersed quietly. Nash gathered his scattered papers. Mrs. Cole folded her hands in silent relief. Harrington lingered a moment longer, gazing at the fireplace, before stepping out into the sunlit corridor. Alone, Miss Marple closed a lacquered box and returned it to the mantel. She brushed her gloved hand across the polished surface, ensuring the evidence remained undisturbed until Violet could claim it. The vicarage clock chimed 11. In the drawing room, peace settled at last, a fragile peace born of confession and forgiveness. And outside, Elmstead Village awoke fully to the promise of a new day, its secrets laid bare, and its community bound anew by the quiet triumph of truth. Chapter 10. Aftermath and reflection. A fortnight later, the spirits of Elmstead Village had settled into a new rhythm, steadied, if not entirely restored, by the subtle passage of truth. Summer's warmth had ripened the rosebuds in the vicarage garden, their petals unfurling in gentle celebration. The village church bell no longer tolled for tragedy, but for Sunday services and village weddings. In the drawing room of Elmstead Vicarage, Miss Jane Marple sat by the hearth, knitting quietly, as Reverend Ambrose Lavington poured tea from the silver samovar. The fire glowed softly, embers dancing like flickers of the past. Violet Grantham, now fully recovered, occupied her usual armchair, angled toward the window. Fresh ribbons bound her hair, and color had returned to her cheeks. She held a letter in her lap, a formal invitation from her aunt in Marston-on-the-Hill to visit and discuss the future of her newfound inheritance. Violet's eyes sparkled with gratitude as she glanced up at her uncle. "You've done more than heal my body, Uncle," she said warmly. "You've preserved my family's honor and given me a chance to right old wrongs." Reverend Lavington inclined his head, fingers brushing the gilded frame of his late wife's portrait. "My dear Violet, your courage reminded us that secrets, once buried for too long, can rot at the core of one's conscience." "I am proud of you," Miss Marple smiled kindly. "And now that the letters have seen the light of day, the past need not burden the present. Forgiveness can bloom just as these roses have bloomed anew, beyond the sunlight streaming through lace curtains." Mrs. Fawcett moved with steady grace, setting a saucer of scones on the tea table. She paused, offering Miss Marple a gentle nod. The housekeeper's eyes bore traces of exhaustion, but also relief that her loyalty to Violet and the vicar had carried them through. As they settled around the table, the door opened softly. Inspector Barnaby entered, hat in hand, though no formal charge was left to be made. Lady Harriet Stretton had departed Elmstead under the quiet understanding of the Crown Prosecution Service. Her confession and the circumstances of her panic had earned her a sympathetic hearing, and she would face a reduced charge of grievous bodily harm with a strong likelihood of leniency. Barnaby's expression was respectful. "Miss Marple," he greeted, offering a slight bow. "I trust I'm not intruding on family matters?" Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Not at all, Inspector. Your visit is most welcome." He moved to stand beside Violet. "I thought you might like to know that Lady Stretton was formally cautioned and released under supervision. Her reputation, while tarnished, remains intact in many circles due to her cooperation." Violet inclined her head, her voice gentle. "I bear no ill will toward her. She was misguided by fear, and I understand that now." Barnaby allowed a small smile. "Your compassion does credit to your character." He turned to Lavington. "And you, Reverend, thank you for your candor. The yard respects the frankness with which you handled this delicate affair." Reverend Lavington clasped his hands. "It was MissMarple's guidance that allowed us to address these matters with both justice and mercy." MissMarple accepted her teacup. "I merely observed what lay before me, Inspector. The people of Elmstead have the true credit for healing their community." At that moment, Mr. Oliver Harrington entered, carrying a small burlap sack. "Begging your pardon," he said, placing the sack on the sideboard. "I thought you might like the first basket of blackberries from the orchard. They're wonderfully ripe this year." Mrs. Cole, arriving behind him with a tray of fresh cream, chuckled softly. "And I'll take these as an apology for my incessant proposing that tea should always include jam." Warm laughter filled the room, gentle, forgiving, as though the shadows of past days had been dispelled by the bright summer light. Even Gregory Nash appeared at the doorway, hands full of legal documents pertaining to Violet's inheritance, an adjusted will, executed with full transparency, restoring her rightful legacy and establishing a trust fund to aid local charities. "In memory of Mrs. Lavington, MissMarple," Nash said, "I took the liberty of drafting the new trust deed. I hope it meets with your approval." He offered her a copy, bound in soft green leather dot. She accepted it with a nod. "Perfectly arranged, Mr. Nash. Your care will ensure Violet's inheritance honors her aunt's true intentions." As the vicarage family and friends gathered around the tea table, MissMarple rose and moved to the hearth. She brushed her hand across the polished poker, now a harmless artifact, rather than an instrument of panic. Carefully she placed Violet's evidence tins side by side on the mantel, their contents long since transcribed and filed. The hearth was restored to its everyday warmth, unburdened by secrets. Turning, she addressed the group. "Let us raise our teacups to a new chapter for Elmstead Vicarage, one built on truth, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of community." They echoed her sentiment, their cups raised, smiles genuine and bright. Outside, a soft breeze stirred the rose petals, sending them drifting like confetti across the lawn dot. In that moment, MissMarple allowed herself a contented sigh. She settled back into her armchair, needles clicking, as she began a fresh row of knitting. Her gaze wandered around the room, at Violet's radiant expression, at the vicar's serene countenance, at Mrs. Cole's gentle smile, at Nash's satisfied nod, at Harrington's thoughtful look, and at Barnaby's approving eyes. Yes, she thought, all was well. The mystery had been unraveled with the subtlety of human observation, and justice tempered with compassion had been served. Elmstead Village would remember this season, not for its tragedy, but for the grace with which its people faced their truths and the kindness that followed. Outside, a robin alighted on the window-sill and tipped its head as though in greeting. MissMarple smiled and whispered, "Quite right, little friend. Truth is the heart's true home." And with that, the old detective returned her attention to her knitting, content in the quiet knowledge that peace had returned to Elmstead Vicarage at last.